The evening air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as David walked his usual patrol route through the forest. He had been working as a park ranger for almost 8 years now, and these quiet walks through the towering trees had become his favorite part of the job. The silence was peaceful, broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. David checked his watch. It was nearly 10 o'clock, and he was about to head back to the ranger station when he noticed something strange. There. It was a soft glow coming from behind a cluster of massive redwood trees about 50 yards off the main trail. At first he thought it might be campers with a flashlight, but something about the light seemed different. It was too steady, too bright, and it had an odd blue-white color that didn't look like any flashlight he'd ever seen. He adjusted his radio and flashlight on his belt, then made his way carefully through the underbrush toward the mysterious light. As he got closer, his steps became more cautious. In his years as a ranger, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and right now, something felt very unusual about this situation. When David pushed through the last row of ferns and stepped into a small clearing, he stopped dead in his tracks. The light was coming from a woman sitting alone on the forest floor, her back against one of the enormous tree trunks. But this wasn't just any woman. There was something about her that made his heart race, and his mind struggled to process. What he was seeing, she looked human, but not quite right. Her arms and legs seemed a bit too long for her body, and her skin had a strange shimmer to it, like it was reflecting moonlight even though the moon was hidden behind clouds. Her hair was dark and seemed to move slightly, even though there was no wind. Most striking of all were her eyes. They were large and seemed to hold depths that reminded him of looking up at the stars on a clear night. The woman was shivering violently. Not the kind of shivering you do when you're cold, but more like someone who had just received terrible news or experienced something traumatic. Her clothes were torn in several places, and they looked like they were made from some kind of material David had never seen before. The fabric seemed to change color slightly as she moved, shifting between deep blue and silver. David's training kicked in immediately. Regardless of how strange this situation was, there was clearly someone in distress who needed help. A slow step forward and called out in his most gentle, non-threatening voice, "Hello there. I'm David, and I'm a park ranger here. Are you hurt? Do you need help?" The woman's head snapped up at the sound of his voice, and when their eyes met, David felt something he couldn't quite describe, like a warm feeling in his chest that spread outward to his fingertips. She looked at him with an expression that seemed to be a mixture of fear, hope, something that might have been relief. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but the only sound that came out was a soft, musical humming that seemed to have more notes in it than any human voice should be able to produce. Her lips moved like she was trying to form words, but whatever language she was attempting to use was completely foreign to David's ears. As David watched, the woman tried to stand up, but her legs seemed unsteady. She reached out with one hand to brace herself against the tree trunk, and David noticed that her fingers were longer than they should be, with what looked like very faint lines running along them that glowed softly in the dim light. "It's okay," David said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help." He slowly reached for his radio to call for backup, but as he did, the woman made a sound that was clearly distressed. She shook her head quickly and held up both hands in what was obviously a gesture, asking him to stop. Her eyes were wide, and David could see real fear in them. Something in her expression made David pause. He had dealt with people in crisis before. Lost hikers, injured campers, people running from difficult situations, but this was different. This woman seemed afraid, not just of him, but of something much bigger. The fear in her eyes wasn't the fear of a stranger, it was the fear of someone who had been through something terrible, was desperately hoping for kindness. David made a decision that would change everything. Slowly put his radio back on his belt and held up his empty hands to show he wasn't a threat. The woman's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she nodded once in what seemed like gratitude. "I don't know who you are or where you came from," David said quietly, "but I can see you're in trouble, and I'm going to help you, okay? That's what I do, I help people." As he spoke, David noticed that the woman seemed to be listening not just to his words, but to something deeper. Her head tilted slightly to one side, like she was trying to understand not just what he was saying, but what he meant. And somehow, despite the language barrier, he got the feeling that she was beginning to understand that he truly wanted to help her. The strange light that surrounded her seemed to pulse gently, and David realized that whatever was happening here was far beyond anything he had ever experienced. But his instinct to help someone in need was stronger than his confusion or fear. This was just the beginning of the most extraordinary night of David's life. David stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what to do next. The woman was still sitting against the tree, and he could see that she was struggling. Her breathing was quick and shallow, and that strange shimmer on her skin seemed to be getting weaker. Whatever was wrong with her, it was getting worse. He took a careful step closer, moving slowly so he wouldn't scare her. As he got nearer, he could see more details that made his mind reel. Her skin wasn't just shimmering, it was actually giving off a very faint light, like she had tiny stars under her skin. But that light was definitely getting dimmer, and David's instincts told him that wasn't a good sign. "Are you cold?" he asked, even though he knew she probably couldn't understand him. But sometimes tone of voice said more than words, and he hoped she could hear the genuine concern in his voice. The woman looked up at him, and those incredible eyes seemed to be trying to communicate something urgent. She wrapped her arms around herself and shivered again, this time so violently that David could hear her teeth chattering. But it wasn't the kind of cold shivering he was used to seeing. This seemed different, like her whole body was trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. David's years of experience in the wilderness kicked in. He had helped plenty of people who were suffering from exposure, hypothermia, and shock. While he didn't understand exactly what was happening to this woman, he recognized the signs of someone whose body was in serious distress. Without hesitation, he reached into his emergency pack and pulled out his thermal blanket. It was one of those space-age-looking things, thin and silvery, designed to reflect body heat back to keep people warm. He'd used it dozens of times over the years to help injured hikers and lost campers. "Here," he said softly, unfolding the blanket. "This will help." As he approached her with the blanket, the woman's eyes grew even wider. She watched his every movement with intense focus, like she was trying to understand not just what he was doing, but why he was doing it. David moved very slowly, giving her plenty of time to see what he intended. When he knelt down beside her and gently placed the blanket around her shoulders, something amazing happened. The moment the silvery material touched her skin, her whole body seemed to relax. The violent shivering stopped almost instantly, and that faint glow under her skin began to grow brighter again. But what really surprised David was her reaction. The woman looked down at the blanket like it was the most precious thing she had ever seen. She touched it with her fingertips, running them along the material with an expression of wonder and disbelief. Then she looked up at David with tears in those strange, beautiful eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, and even though the words were in that musical language he didn't understand, the meaning was crystal clear. Her voice was soft and had an odd harmonic quality to it, like hearing a beautiful song played very quietly. David felt something warm spread through his chest when she looked at him. It was a feeling he'd never experienced before, not just satisfaction from helping someone, but something deeper. It's like he had just done something that mattered on a level he couldn't quite grasp. The woman pulled the blanket closer around herself. David could see that it was helping. Her breathing became more regular, and the light under her skin continued to grow steadier. She pressed one hand to her heart and then extended it toward him in a gesture that needed no translation. It was pure gratitude. David sat back on his heels, still amazed by what he was seeing. "I don't know who you are," he said quietly, "but you're going to be okay. Promise." She tilted her head at his words, and David got the strangest feeling that she was understanding him better than should be possible. Not the words exactly, but the intent behind them. The kindness and genuine care that he was trying to express. As the minutes passed, David found himself relaxing too. The initial shock of finding someone so unusual was giving way to a different feeling, a sense of connection that he couldn't explain. This woman, whoever or whatever she was, needed help, and he was able to provide it. That was what mattered. He reached for his radio again, but more gently this time. "I need to call for help," he said, showing her the radio. "Medical assistance." To his surprise, she understood enough to shake her head. She pointed to herself, then to the sky, then made a gesture that looked like she was saying, "Wait." David paused, his finger hovering over the radio button. Something in her expression made him stop. She wasn't just asking him not to call for help, she was asking him to trust her, to give her time. David had learned over the years to read people, and even though this woman was unlike anyone he'd ever met, could see honesty in her eyes. He put the radio back on his belt and settled in to wait. Whatever was happening here, he was committed to seeing it through. The woman smiled at him then, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it lit up her whole face. David realized that this simple act of giving someone a blanket had somehow connected him to something far bigger than he could have imagined, and he was ready to find out what that meant. As David sat there watching the woman, he noticed something incredible happening. With each passing minute, she seemed to be getting stronger. The glow under her skin was becoming brighter and more steady, and her breathing had returned to normal. It was like watching someone come back to life right before his eyes. After about 20 minutes, she began to move differently. Instead of the weak, shaky movements from before, she started to shift with a kind of grace that David had never seen in any human being. When she finally stood up, keeping the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, it was like watching water flow upward. Her movements were so smooth and effortless that it almost seemed like she was floating. David stood up too, keeping a respectful distance but staying close enough to help if she needed it. Now that she was standing, he could see just how tall she was. She had to be at least 6 feet, maybe more, and those long limbs that had seemed so strange before now looked elegant and purposeful. She turned to face him fully, and when their eyes met, David felt something he couldn't explain. It was like she was looking right through him, not in a scary way, but like she could see things about him that he didn't even know about himself. Her gaze seemed to reach past his eyes and touch something deep inside his heart. Then she began to speak, and David realized something amazing was happening. Even though she was still using that musical language he couldn't understand, somehow he was starting to get the meaning behind her words. It wasn't like he could translate them exactly, but he could feel what she was trying to tell him. She pointed up at the sky with one long finger, and David looked up to see the stars beginning to show through the clouds. When he looked back at her, she was making sweeping gestures with her arms, like she was describing something vast and far away. Her voice rose and fell in patterns that sounded almost like a song, and David found himself leaning forward, trying to catch every note. Touched her chest, then pointed to the sky again, and David felt a chill run down his spine. Not a bad chill, but the kind you get when you suddenly understand something important. She was trying to tell him where she came from. It wasn't anywhere on Earth. The woman must have seen the understanding in his eyes because she nodded and continued her story. She held up her left wrist, and David saw what looked like a small device attached to it. It was about the size of a watch, but it was made of some kind of material that seemed to shift and change color as she moved. Right now, it was barely glowing. It's just a faint pulse of light every few seconds. She tapped the device and made a sound that was clearly frustrated. Then she gestured around the forest, spread her arms wide, and shook her head sadly. David was starting to understand. Whatever that device was, it was broken or not working properly. And that meant she was stuck here, separated from wherever she belonged. The thought hit David like a physical blow. This woman wasn't just lost in the forest, she was lost in a way that was almost impossible to imagine. She was stranded on an entire planet that wasn't her home, surrounded by people who couldn't understand her language or even believe what she was. But then something even more incredible happened. The woman stepped closer to David, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. She reached out very slowly and placed her hand on his arm. The moment her fingers touched him, David felt a rush of emotions that weren't his own. He could feel her loneliness, deep and vast, like an ocean. but he could also feel her amazement and gratitude. Through some connection he couldn't understand. He realized that his simple act of kindness had meant more to her than he could have imagined. In whatever world she came from, the fact that a complete stranger had helped her without asking for anything in return was something rare and precious. She began to speak again. This time David could almost understand her words. They seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to his mind. She was telling him about her people, about how they had been watching Earth for a long time. She was explaining that most of them believed humans were too violent and selfish to be trusted. But David's actions had surprised her. The way he had approached her with kindness instead of fear, the way he had given her his blanket without expecting anything in return. It had shown her something about humans that she hadn't expected to find. As she spoke, David felt his radio crackle to life on his belt. He reached for it, expecting to hear the familiar voice of his dispatcher, but instead there was nothing but static. He pulled out his phone to check for signal, but the screen showed no bars at all. It was like all the technology around them had suddenly stopped working. David looked at the woman, and she nodded, as if she understood his confusion. She pointed to herself, then to the various devices on his belt, and made a gesture that seemed to say sorry. Somehow, her presence was interfering with electronic equipment. "That's okay," David said aloud, even though he wasn't sure she could understand his words. "I'm not going anywhere." The woman smiled at him then, and David felt that warm feeling in his chest grow stronger. Whatever was happening here, whatever impossible situation he had stumbled into, he knew that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The night was still young, and David had the feeling that the most incredible part of this encounter was yet to come. The woman stood there for a long moment, just looking at David with those incredible eyes. He could feel that she was making some kind of decision, weighing something important in her mind. The air around them seemed to hum with energy, and David noticed that the trees nearby were completely still, as if even the wind was holding its breath. Then she began to move with purpose. She reached toward what looked like a fold in her strange clothing, though David couldn't see any visible pockets or openings. Her hand seemed to disappear into the fabric for a moment, and when she pulled it back out, she was holding something that made David's breath catch in his throat. It was a crystal, about the size of a chicken egg, but unlike any crystal he had ever seen. The surface was perfectly smooth and seemed to contain its own light source. Colors swirled inside it like tiny galaxies, shifting from deep blue to silver to gold and back again. The light it gave off was warm and gentle, not harsh like electric light, but more like captured sunlight. David stared at the crystal, mesmerized. He had seen plenty of interesting rocks and minerals in his years as a park ranger, but this was something entirely different. This wasn't just a pretty stone, it was clearly some kind of technology. Though it looked more like a work of art than any machine he could imagine, the woman held the crystal out toward him with both hands. And David could see that her expression had become very serious. She spoke in her musical language, but this time her tone was formal, almost ceremonial. Even though he couldn't understand the words, he could feel the importance of what she was saying. She gestured to the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, then to the crystal, then back to David. She was trying to explain something about the connection between his gift to her and what she was offering him in return. David felt a flutter of nervousness in his stomach. This was clearly something significant, not just a simple thank you gift. "I don't understand," David said quietly. "What is it?" The woman stepped closer, and David could see that there were actually tears in her eyes. She reached out very gently and took his hand, turning his palm upward. Her touch was warm and sent a strange tingling sensation up his arm. She placed the crystal in his palm, and the moment it touched his skin, everything changed. The world exploded into new colors and sensations that David had never experienced before. It was like someone had suddenly turned on lights in a house he had been living in his whole life, but had never realized was dark. He could feel the woman's emotions as clearly as if they were his own. Her gratitude, her loneliness, her hope, and something else that felt like ancient wisdom. But it wasn't just her emotions he could sense. David suddenly became aware of the life force of everything around him. He could feel the slow, patient thoughts of the enormous trees, the quick, bright consciousness of small animals moving through the underbrush, even the simple awareness of insects and plants. The forest was alive in a way he had never imagined. Most incredible of all, he could now understand the woman's words perfectly. Her voice, which had been musical but incomprehensible before, now spoke to him as clearly as if she had been speaking English his entire life. "You gave me warmth when I was lost and frightened," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Among my people, such compassion cannot go unacknowledged. This gift will allow you to understand the hearts of others, to sense their true intentions and feelings. It is only a small part of what my people can do, but it is given freely in gratitude for your kindness." David looked down at the crystal in his hand, then back up at her face. "I don't know if I should accept this," he said. "Mean all I did was give you a blanket?" Anyone would have done the same thing. The woman shook her head sadly. "No, David, most would not. My people have been watching your world for many generations. We have seen how your people treat strangers, how they respond to those who are different. Acts of genuine kindness, given without expectation of reward, are much rarer than you might think." As she spoke, David could feel the truth of her words. The crystal was somehow showing him glimpses of her people's observations of Earth, images of conflicts, coup of people turning away from those in need, of fear and suspicion driving apart those who could have helped each other. But he also saw the other side, moments of incredible bravery and selflessness. People risking their own safety to help strangers, communities coming together in times of crisis. "Your willingness to help me, despite your fear and confusion, marks you as someone who can be trusted," she continued. "Someone who chooses compassion over suspicion. This is why you have been chosen to receive this gift." David felt overwhelmed by the implications of what she was telling him. Chosen for what? The woman smiled, and David could feel her affection for him like warm sunlight. "To be a bridge, David, to help your people remember what they are capable of when they choose love over fear. The gift I have given you will help you recognize others who share your nature and guide them toward their own moments of choice." David closed his fingers around the crystal, feeling its warmth spread through his entire body. He looked at this amazing woman who had somehow changed his life forever with a single encounter. And he knew that nothing would ever be the same. "Thank you," he said simply, and meant it more than he had ever meant anything in his life. As the first hints of dawn began to touch the eastern sky, David could sense that something was changing. The woman beside him had grown quiet, and he could feel through their connection that she was preparing for something. There was a bitter sweetness in her emotions that made his heart ache. She looked up at the sky, where the stars were beginning to fade in the growing light, and touched the device on her wrist. This time, instead of the weak pulse it had been giving before, it glowed with steady, bright light. David could hear a very faint humming sound coming from it, so low that he felt it more than heard it. "They're coming," she said softly, and David knew she was talking about her people. Can feel them approaching. David felt a sudden panic. Wasn't ready for this to end. In just a few hours, this woman had changed everything he thought he knew about the world, about life, about what was possible. The thought of her leaving felt like losing a part of himself he had just discovered. "Will I ever see you again?" he asked, trying to keep the sadness out of his voice. She turned to him with those incredible eyes, and David could feel her own regret about having to leave. "I don't know," she said honestly. "My people don't usually return to the same place twice. But David, you must understand this encounter was not accidental. The crystal I gave you will ensure that our paths cross again, even if not in the way you might expect." She stood up, and David rose with her. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, but she no longer needed it. Her skin was glowing with that inner light again, brighter than it had been all night. She looked strong and healthy, completely transformed. From the frightened, shivering woman he had found hours ago, "There's something else I need to tell you," she said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Your world is at a crossroads. There are forces at work that would use fear and hatred to divide your people, to make them forget the compassion that makes them truly human. But there are also those like you who choose kindness over suspicion." David felt the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. What am I supposed to do about that? Use the gift I've given you, she replied. It will help you recognize others who have the same capacity for goodness that you do. When you find them, guide them. Help them remember who they really are. Small acts of kindness, like the one you showed me tonight, can spread farther than you might imagine. The humming sound was getting louder now, and David realized it was coming from above them. He looked up but couldn't see anything in the pre-dawn sky. However, he could feel a presence approaching, something vast and peaceful. That made the hair on his arms stand up. The woman followed his gaze upward and smiled. They're here, she said. It's time for me to go. David felt a lump forming in his throat. I don't even know your name, he said. Names are different among my people, she replied. But you can think of me as ... She paused, searching for words. He would understand. You can call me Luna. In your language, it means light, and that's what you gave me tonight. Hope and light, when I had neither. She stepped closer to David one last time and placed her hand on his forehead. The moment her fingers touched his skin, David felt a rush of images and emotions. He saw glimpses of her world, vast cities. That seemed to be made of light itself, beings who moved through the air like they were swimming through water. Technology that was so advanced it looked like magic. But more than that, he felt her profound gratitude and respect for him. In her mind, he wasn't just a park ranger who had helped a stranger. He was a representative of the best that humanity could be, proof that his species was worth believing in. Remember, she whispered, the blanket was just fabric. But the compassion you offered with it was real. That is the gift you gave me, and it is more precious than you know. As she began to step back, David noticed something incredible happening. She wasn't just moving away from him, she was becoming translucent, like she was made of moonlight and mist. The air around her shimmered, and David could see through her to the trees behind. Thank you, David, she said, her voice now seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. For showing me that kindness still exists in your world. For reminding me why my people should not give up on humanity. Thank you for choosing me, David replied, clutching the crystal tightly in his hand. For trusting me with this gift. Luna smiled one last time, and then she was gone. Not disappeared exactly, but absorbed into the morning light itself. Leaving David alone in the forest clearing with only the memory of the most extraordinary night of his life and the warm crystal in his palm. David stood there for a long time. Watching the sun rise through the trees, could feel the crystal's power humming gently in his hand. And he knew that his life had just taken a turn toward something he couldn't even imagine yet. He was no longer just a park ranger doing his job. He was something new, something more. He carefully tucked the crystal into his pocket and picked up the thermal blanket from where it had fallen. As he walked back toward the ranger station, David felt a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. He had been chosen for something important, and he was ready to discover what that meant. The forest around him seemed different now. He could sense the life in every tree, every blade of grass, every creature that called this place home. Somewhere in the distance, he could feel other human hearts, other people who might be ready to remember what it meant to be truly compassionate. David's new life was just beginning, and he couldn't wait to see where it would lead him.